Do you no longer speak to someone from your wedding party? If so, what happened? Story 1. My wife and I got married 5 years ago, and my best man was my childhood friend, Jake. We had been inseparable since elementary school, so it was a no-brainer that he would stand beside me on my wedding day. Everything was great. Until about a year later, when my wife told me she had been getting weird vibes from Jake. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just awkward around her. Then I saw the messages. He had been texting her, subtly flirting at first, but it escalated. At one point he said, "If things don't work out, you know where to find me." I was furious. I confronted him expecting an apology, but he just smirked and said, "Man, it's not that serious. Just keeping my options open." That was the last time I spoke to him. A guy who could toast to my happiness at my wedding and then try to undermine my marriage had no place in my life. Story 2. My wife's maid of honor, Sarah, was her college best friend. They were close, like sisters. But after the wedding, things got weird. Sarah started acting cold, ignoring texts, making up excuses to avoid hanging out. My wife was heartbroken. Months later, we found out the real reason. One of our mutual friends let it slip. Sarah had been in love with my wife for years. She had hoped my wife would one day realize she felt the same way. When we got married, it crushed her, and she distanced herself completely. My wife reached out, offering to talk, but Sarah refused. She said she needed to cut ties to move on. It was painful, but we had to respect her decision. It still sucks, though, losing a friend that way. Story 3. My cousin Mike was one of my groomsmen. We weren't super close, but we grew up together, and it felt right to have him in my wedding party. On the day of the wedding, he got wasted. Like, can't stand up straight wasted. During his speech, he slurred something about how I was settling, and how my wife was too good for me. Everyone was silent. I laughed it off in the moment, trying to move on, but my wife was hurt. Mike never apologized. When I brought it up later, he said, "Dude, it was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." I haven't spoken to him since. If he ever reaches out with an actual apology, maybe I'd reconsider. But it's been 3 years, and I'm not holding my breath. Story 4. One of my bridesmaids, Lisa, was a friend from high school. We weren't as close as we used to be, but I still wanted her there. During wedding planning, she started making snarky comments about my dress, my venue, my choice of colors. She even joked that I was so brave to wear white. I brushed it off. Then, at the wedding, she crossed the line. She got drunk and started loudly telling guests about my wild phase in college, implying that I had been unfaithful before. It was humiliating. After the honeymoon, I sent her a message telling her how hurt I was. She responded with, "Oh, come on, it was just some fun stories." No apology. No remorse. I blocked her that day. Some friendships don't survive adulthood, and I'm fine with that. Story 5. My wife's brother Alex was my best man. We had always gotten along, but a few months after the wedding, he just stopped talking to us. No reason, no explanation. He ignored my messages, dodged family gatherings, and even skipped our first holiday as a married couple. It took 2 years to find out what happened. Apparently, his ex-girlfriend, who was at our wedding, had told him that my wife and I had badmouthed him behind his back. It was a total lie, but he believed instead of talking to us, he just cut us off. When he finally learned the truth, he apologized, but the damage was done. We're civil now, but we'll never be close again. It still stings. Losing family over something so stupid. Story 6. My wife's cousin Rachel was a bridesmaid at our wedding, and we used to get along great. She was fun, outgoing, and always supportive, until she met my best man, Chris. They hit it off at the rehearsal dinner, and by the wedding night, they were all over each other. At first, it was funny, like, hey, maybe they'll end up together. But then things got weird. 2 months after the wedding, Rachel called my wife, crying, saying Chris ghosted her after a few dates. She was devastated. But instead of being mad at him, she blamed us. She started ranting about how we set her up for heartbreak and how we should have warned her about Chris, even though we had no clue what was going to happen. She stopped talking to my wife entirely, unfollowed her on everything, and even skipped a family event where she knew we'd be. It was the pettiest thing ever. All because she had a fling with my best man. Story 7. One of my groomsmen, Trevor, was my best friend since middle school. The guy had been through everything with me. But I made a mistake. I let him bring his girlfriend, who none of us liked. She was controlling, always had a problem with something, and somehow made everything about her. During my wedding reception, she got mad at Trevor for talking to too many women, even though they were just other guests and family members. She threw a huge tantrum in the middle of the dance floor, screamed at him, then stormed out. Trevor chased after her, missed most of the wedding, and left early. I reached out later to check on him, but he never responded. A month later, I found out through mutual friends that his girlfriend had convinced him I was a bad influence, and that he needed to cut ties with. He didn't even try to talk to me about it. After nearly 15 years of friendship, he ghosted me. I saw on Facebook that he married her last year. I hope he's happy, but I'll never understand how he let that happen. Story 8. My sister was my maid of honor, and I regret it to this day. She was always jealous of me growing up, but I thought we had moved past that. I was so wrong. From the moment I got engaged, she started making snide remarks. When I picked my wedding dress, she laughed and said, "Are you sure? It's kind of basic." When we were planning the bachelorette party, she kept forgetting to invite half my friends. But the real kicker? On my wedding day, she showed up wearing a white dress. And not just any white dress, a full-on lace-covered floor-length gown. My mom tried to get her to change, but she refused. When people started whispering, she acted offended, saying I was overreacting. We didn't speak for months after that. She eventually apologized, but it felt forced. I keep my distance now. Blood or not, some people just don't want you to be happy. Story 9. One of my husband's groomsmen, Tyler, was that guy. Loud. Always making everything a joke and always had to be the center of attention. We knew he was a wild card, but my husband had been friends with him forever, so we let it slide. Big mistake. During our wedding toast, Tyler started his speech like normal, then suddenly dropped the bomb. Crazy to think this guy used to swear he'd never get married. And even crazier to think how long it took him to get over his ex. Dead silence. I felt my stomach drop. I looked at my husband, and his face was pale. I had never even heard about this supposed ex he was hung up on. Guests started whispering. My mom gave me a look. I wanted to disappear. After the wedding, my husband assured me it was a lie. Just Tyler being an idiot and trying to be funny. But the damage was done. We had our first big fight as a married couple because of him. My husband cut Tyler off after that, and honestly, good riddance. Story 10. My childhood best friend Megan was my bridesmaid. We had been through everything together. But looking back, I should have realized our friendship had already been dying before my wedding. She was distant during the planning, missed fittings, and never answered texts. I kept making excuses for her. She's busy, she's stressed, she's just not a wedding person. But at the wedding, she barely spoke to me. She sat with a group of acquaintances, didn't dance, and left early. A week later, I texted her to ask if everything was okay. She replied, "TBH, I just don't feel like we're that close anymore. Weddings just make that obvious, you know?" That was it. No real explanation. Just a casual, thoughtless breakup of a 15-year friendship. I cried that night. Then I deleted her number. Some people show their true colors when it's time to celebrate you. Story 11. My husband's best friend, Mark, was his best man. They had been inseparable since high school, so it never even crossed our minds that he would be a problem. But looking back, I should have seen the signs. Mark had never been a fan of. He wasn't rude exactly, just dismissive, like I was some phase my husband was going through. He always joked, "You sure you're ready to be locked down?" and even suggested a bachelor party in Vegas, just to be sure. My husband brushed it off as harmless banter. Then came the wedding. Mark gave his speech and ended it with, "Hope you're ready for a lifetime of yes, dear. Blink twice if you need an escape plan, bro." People laughed, but I saw my husband's jaw clench. After we got back from our honeymoon, Mark became distant. He ignored texts, skipped meetups, and eventually just stopped showing up altogether. I later found out from a mutual friend that Mark hated that my husband chose me over him. I expected better from a grown man. But I guess some people never get past high school. Story 12. My maid of honor, Jen, had been my best friend since college. She was the life of every party, the one who could make me laugh until I cried. But she had one major flaw. She couldn't stand not being the center of attention. During the wedding planning, she kept making weird comments like, "I don't know how you're handling all this." I would be losing my mind. When I asked what she meant, she just smiled and said, "Oh, nothing." Then, at the wedding reception, she dropped the bombshell. Right before I made my way to the dance floor for the first dance, Jen tapped her glass and said, "Before we celebrate the happy couple, I have some news. I'm engaged." Cue gasps, applause, and everyone shifting their attention to my moment. Gone in an instant. My heart sank as she beamed, flashing her ring around. My wedding reception turned into Jen's engagement party. We haven't spoken since. She still doesn't understand why what she did was wrong. And honestly, I don't have the energy to explain it to her. Story 13. My cousin David was a groomsman at our wedding, and he's the reason I no longer speak to half of my extended family. The wedding was beautiful. The reception was going perfectly, until David decided to start a drunken debate at his table about politics. It got heated. At first, I didn't notice. Then I heard raised voices. By the time I got over there, he was full on yelling at my wife's uncle, calling him an idiot and brainwashed. Security had to escort him out. He screamed all the way to the parking lot. My mom cried. My aunt blamed me for not stopping it sooner. After the honeymoon, I reached out, thinking maybe he'd apologize. Instead, he doubled down, saying, I was just speaking the truth. If people can't handle it, that's their problem. I told him to lose my number. I haven't spoken to him since. Family or not, I refuse to let someone ruin my biggest day and act like it was my fault. Story 14. One of my bridesmaids, Kylie, was a coworker I had become close with. She was funny, easy to talk to, and always had my back, until I got engaged. Almost immediately, she started acting weird. She made passive-aggressive comments like, ugh, weddings are so expensive. I'd never make my friends pay for a dress they'll only wear once. She rolled her eyes when I talked about my excitement and avoided any actual planning. Then, the night before the wedding, she texted, hey, I don't think I can do this. Weddings just aren't my thing. I hope you understand. Understand? Understand? She ghosted me after that. No apology. No explanation. She wasn't sick. She wasn't dealing with a crisis. She just didn't feel like showing up. She still works at the same company, but we don't speak. I don't think I'll ever forgive her for bailing on me like that. Story 15. My husband's sister, Emily, was my bridesmaid. I thought we got along fine, until the wedding planning started. She made everything difficult. She refused to wear the dress we picked, insisted we change the bachelorette party plans, and made rude comments about the food we were serving. I held my tongue, thinking, she's just opinionated. It'll be fine. Then came the wedding day. During the family photos, she refused to stand next to me. The photographer kept asking her to move, and she just stood there, arms crossed, glaring at me. I was so confused. Later, she made sure to tell my husband, you could have done better. I was done. After the wedding, she acted like nothing had happened. When my husband confronted her, she rolled her eyes and said she was just being honest. He told her that if she couldn't respect me, she didn't need to be in our lives. It's been 2 years. She hasn't spoken to us since. And honestly, our lives are better without her. Story 16. I used to be best friends with my cousin Eric. He was my groomsman and I thought we were solid. But my wedding was the moment I realized he wasn't the person I thought he was. Everything was fine until my wife and I had our first dance. I noticed some people looking at their phones and whispering, but I ignored it. Until my best man pulled me aside and showed me Eric's Instagram story. He had posted, enjoying the last few hours before he realizes what a mistake he made. RIP to his freedom. I was livid. Not only was he trashing my marriage, but he was doing it while standing in my wedding party. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said, dude, it's just a joke. After that, I decided I was done. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years. Story 17. My former best friend Olivia was my maid of honor. She had been my closest friend for over a decade, so I never thought I'd lose her over something so ridiculous. She had recently started dating a new guy, and she became obsessed with making my wedding about their relationship. She kept saying things like, I just know he's going to propose soon. What if it happens at your wedding? I laughed it off, thinking she was just being overexcited. Then, at the reception, she literally dragged her boyfriend onto the dance floor, pulled out a tiny black box, and tried to pressure him into proposing in the middle of my wedding. He looked horrified. He kept shaking his head while she laughed, saying, come on, do it. It would be so romantic. Everyone was staring. My wedding basically paused while she tried to force a proposal out of this poor guy. Eventually, he walked away and she stormed off crying. I reached out later, hoping to talk it through, but she told me I was selfish for being upset and accused me of ruining her relationship. I cut her off after that. No regrets. Story 18. One of my husband's groomsmen, Derek, was an old college friend. My husband swore he was a great guy, but I hated him from the start. He was the kind of guy who thought he was hilarious but was just deeply annoying. At our wedding, he got plastered. No big deal, until he grabbed the mic during the toasts, uninvited, and decided to go off script. He started talking about my husband's exes. Man, I never thought I'd see the day. You know, back in college, this guy had a new girlfriend every semester. Anyone remember Jessica? Or Laura? Oh, and that one who I wanted to sink into the floor. My parents were watching. My husband looked like he wanted to commit murder, and I could see guests shifting awkwardly. The best man yanked the mic away, but the damage was done. Derek was kicked out, and my husband cut him off for good. Honestly, I wish we had never invited him. Story 19. My sister-in-law, Haley, was one of my bridesmaids. I should have known that was a mistake when she demanded a different dress than the other girls because she didn't like the color I picked. But the real issue came on my wedding day. I had a very sentimental hairpiece, my grandmother's. I had planned to wear it all along, but when it was time to get ready, it was gone. I was in full panic mode, searching everywhere. Then I saw Haley wearing it. I was in shock. I asked her to take it off, and she said, "Oh, I just wanted to try it on. It looked so pretty with my dress." I was furious. She acted like it was nothing. My maid of honor ripped it out of her hair and gave it back to me, but the damage was done. We are very low contact. My husband supports me completely, and Haley still pretends she doesn't know why I don't talk to her. Story 20. My childhood friend Jake was one of my groomsmen. We had been through everything together, so I was blindsided by what happened at my wedding. Jake was single, and I had set him up with one of my wife's bridesmaids, thinking it would be a fun, no-pressure night for them. I had no idea how insane he would get. At first, things seemed fine. They danced a little, laughed, and had drinks together. But then he started cornering her, getting possessive, and acting like they were already a couple. When she tried to walk away, he grabbed her arm. That was it for me. I had security remove him from the venue. The next day, I called him to tell him how messed up his behavior was. Instead of apologizing, he went off on me, saying I ruined his chance and that I should have been on his side. I blocked his number. That was the end of a 15-year friendship. Story 21. My best friend Matt was my best man. We had been close since college, and I never thought anything could break our friendship. But I underestimated how much he hated my wife. I always knew Matt wasn't her biggest fan, but I thought it was just because she was new to our group. Turns out, he had been telling everyone that she was controlling and manipulative behind my back. I didn't know any of this until my wedding night. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside and said, "You still have time to run, bro. We can leave right now. Just say the word." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he was dead serious. When I told him to stop, he said, "You'll regret this. Give it a year." That was the last conversation we ever had. He didn't even say goodbye, just left the reception and never reached out again. It's been 4 years and I'm still happily married. Guess he was wrong. Story 22. One of my bridesmaids, Taylor, had a thing for drama. She loved gossip, stirring the pot, and making everything about her. I had been friends with her since high school, so I thought I could handle it. I was so wrong. On my wedding day, just hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, Taylor pulled me aside and said, "I need to tell you something. I saw your fiancé out with another woman last week. They were holding hands." I felt like I was going to pass out. My stomach dropped. But when I pressed for details, she got super vague. She didn't know the girl's name, didn't have a picture, couldn't even say what day it was. I was panicking, but then my maid of honor walked in and said, "She's lying." Turns out Taylor had done this before, spreading rumors, trying to ruin relationships. My other friends knew about her history of lying, but I had been too naive to believe it. I told her to get out of my wedding. She left in a huff, crying about how I was the bad friend. I haven't spoken to her since. Story 23. My Uncle Mike was my groomsman because my dad pressured me into it. I didn't want him in the wedding party. He was always a loudmouth, drank too much, and never took anything seriously. But I agreed to keep the peace. Big mistake. At the reception, he got absolutely wasted and started flirting with my mother-in-law. It was beyond uncomfortable. He kept making comments like, "I see where the bride gets her good looks," and even tried to dance with. My father-in-law almost punched him. When I told him to cut it out, he laughed and said, "Relax, it's just a joke." But my wife was mortified, and I was done. We haven't spoken since. Story 24. My wife's childhood friend, Brianna, was her bridesmaid. They had grown up together, but I always felt like Brianna was a little too obsessed with my wife. She would get weirdly jealous whenever my wife spent time with other people, and she hated me from the moment we started dating. During the wedding planning, she made everything difficult. She complained about her dress, rolled her eyes at our venue, and kept saying things like, "Are you sure you're ready for marriage? You're not even 30. Then, on our wedding night, she confessed her love to my wife. She cornered her at the reception and begged her not to go through with the marriage. She said, "I've always loved you. You don't have to be with him. We could run away together." My wife was horrified. She told Brianna she was out of line, but Brianna just stormed out and left without saying goodbye. She sent a long, dramatic email a few weeks later about how my wife had broken her heart. My wife never responded. That was the end of their 20-year friendship. Story 25. My cousin Sarah was my maid of honor. She had been my best friend since childhood, and I couldn't imagine getting married without her by my side. Everything was fine, until she realized she wasn't the center of attention. At the reception, she suddenly started crying, like full-on sobbing. At first, I panicked, thinking something horrible had happened. But when I asked what was wrong, she sniffled and said, "I just realized I'm probably never going to have a wedding of my own." I was speechless. She was sitting at the head table crying about how my wedding was making her feel bad about herself. Guests started comforting her, People were gathering around, and suddenly the focus was on her sadness. My new husband and I had to awkwardly wait for people to finish hugging her before we could do our cake cutting. I was furious. She apologized later, but I couldn't get past it. That was the moment I realized she only loved me when she wasn't jealous. We talk occasionally, but it's never been the same. Story 26. My brother Adam was my best man. We had always been close, so I didn't think twice about having him by my side. But looking back, I should have realized that he wasn't happy for me at all. A few months before the wedding, he started making passive-aggressive comments like, "Wow, didn't think you'd be the first one to settle down," and "Marriage is just a piece of paper, man, don't rush it." I thought he was just being cynical, but then, at the rehearsal dinner, he got drunk and told my fiancée, "You sure you want to do this? My brother can be a real piece of—" She laughed it off, thinking he was joking. But I knew he wasn't. On the wedding day, he showed up late, barely spoke to me, and gave the lamest best man speech ever. Something like, "Well, here we are. He's married now. Good luck, buddy." After that, he stopped answering my calls. My mom eventually told me he was jealous. He had been going through a rough breakup, and watching me get married made him feel like a failure. It's been 2 years and we barely talk. He never apologized, and honestly, I stopped waiting for him to. Story 27. One of my bridesmaids, Kelsey, was a co-worker turned friend. She was fun, energetic, and always down for a good time. The problem? She thought my wedding was just another party, and she treated it that way. It started at the bachelorette party. She got wasted and ended the night by making out with a random guy at the bar, while his girlfriend was standing right there. Drama erupted, and we almost got kicked out of the venue. I should have cut her off right then, but I was too nice. At the wedding, she kept sneaking extra drinks and eventually got so drunk she fell into the wedding cake. I didn't even see it happen. I just heard a gasp, turned around, and saw my cake on the floor, with Kelsey sitting next to it, laughing her ass off. I was done. She texted me the next day saying, "OMG, I was so drunk last night. Hope you're not mad." I never replied, and I never spoke to her again. Story 28. My husband's cousin Ryan was one of his groomsmen. We had no issues with him, until we realized he had invited his ex-girlfriend to our wedding without telling us. Ryan and this girl had dated for years, but their breakup was messy. She wasn't just an ex. She was his cheating, manipulative nightmare of an ex. My husband hated her, so you can imagine our shock when we saw her walk into our reception like she belonged there. At first, we thought maybe she was someone's plus one. But no, Ryan had personally invited her, saying he thought it would be nice to reconnect. The worst part? She made a scene. She got drunk and started crying about how she missed Ryan and couldn't believe he moved on. Then she tried to dance with my husband, yes, the groom, while slurring, "You always thought I was pretty, right?" We had security escort her out. When we confronted Ryan, he laughed and said, "She just wanted closure." We haven't spoken to him since. Story 29. My childhood friend, Lauren, was my maid of honor. She was supposed to be my biggest supporter, but instead, she spent the entire engagement competing with me. She got engaged 6 months before I did, and instead of celebrating our milestones together, she turned everything into a battle. If I picked a venue, she'd criticize it. If I talked about my dress, she'd say hers was so much more unique. But the final straw? At my rehearsal dinner, she stood up and announced she was pregnant. I had no idea she was even trying for a baby. She hadn't told any, and she decided to drop this huge news bomb right before my wedding day. Of course, everyone went wild, congratulating her. My dinner turned into her celebration. I could barely focus because all I heard was, "Oh my God, when are you due? How are you feeling?" I confronted her about it later and she just smiled and said, "I thought you'd be happy for me." I realized then that she was never really my friend, just someone who needed to be in the spotlight at all times. We haven't spoken in years. Story 30. My husband's childhood friend, Kevin, was his best man. He was always a bit of a prankster, but we assumed he knew where the line was. Turns out, he absolutely did not. The night before the wedding, Kevin thought it would be hilarious to set my husband up on a fake bachelor party dare. He hired a random woman to pretend to be my husband's ex and confront him in front of the whole wedding party, claiming they had unfinished business. It was supposed to be a prank, but my husband didn't recognize her, and she was really convincing. She kept saying, "You don't even remember me." After everything, I walked into the room right as this was happening. I have never seen my husband look so scared. He was trying to explain that he had no idea who she was, and I just stood there, watching this insane scene on. Kevin, meanwhile, was crying with laughter in the corner. Finally, she broke character and yelled, "Just kidding!" I didn't speak. My husband didn't speak. Nobody laughed except Kevin. We kicked him out of the wedding party that night. He wasn't even invited to the ceremony. He still doesn't think he did anything wrong. but we don't speak to him anymore. Story 31. My former best friend Amanda was my maid of honor. We had been friends since middle school, so there was never a doubt in my mind that she'd stand beside me on my wedding day. But what I didn't expect was that she'd turn my wedding into her own personal game of sabotage. It started small. She accidentally forgot to send out my bridal shower invitations, meaning only half my guests got. Then she picked a fight with my other bridesmaids over everything. The dress, the bachelorette trip, even what color their nails should be. But the final straw? At the reception, during her speech, she went off script. She smiled at me sweetly, then said, "I remember when the bride used to swear she'd never get married, especially not to a guy like groom's name." Everyone froze. My husband looked at me confused. Amanda laughed like it was some inside joke. I felt sick. It wasn't true. I had never said anything like that, but she made it sound so believable. I pulled her aside after and asked, "Why would you say that?" She just shrugged and said, "It was funny. Lighten up." I haven't spoken to her since. Some friendships aren't meant to last a lifetime. Story 32. One of my husband's groomsmen, Danny, was an old high school buddy. They weren't super close anymore, but my husband wanted to include him. I wish he hadn't. From the moment the wedding weekend started, Danny acted like he was the main character. He constantly talked about how weddings were a waste of money and how my husband was crazy for tying himself down. He said it in a joking way, but it got old fast. Then came the reception. While we were taking photos, Danny grabbed the mic and started an impromptu speech. He rambled about their high school days, how wild my husband used to be, and then said, "Man, if you had told me back then that you'd end up married, I would have bet my life against it." People laughed nervously, but then he turned to me and said, "You must be one hell of a woman to pull this off." I could feel my face burn. My husband was furious. He took the mic away, but the damage was done. After the wedding, Danny texted my husband saying I needed to chill because it was just a joke. My husband blocked him. Good riddance. Story 33. My cousin Leah was a bridesmaid. We had been close growing up, but as we got older, I noticed she always had this competitive streak, especially when it came to relationships. She wasn't in a relationship at the time of my wedding, and I could tell she hated it. At the bachelorette party, she kept saying things like, "Ugh, I can't believe I'm the only single one here." Then, at the wedding, she tried to seduce my husband's brother. At first, it was harmless flirting, but then she got sloppy drunk. She cornered him, kept touching his arm, and at one point she literally whispered in his ear, "We should sneak away." He looked so uncomfortable. He excused himself, told my husband what was happening, and my husband pulled me aside. We both agreed. We had to get her out of there. I asked my dad to take her home before she embarrassed herself even more. She screamed at me, saying I was ruining her night. We haven't spoken since. And honestly, I don't miss her. Story 34. My husband's childhood friend Patrick was his best man. I had never liked Pat. He was one of those guys who constantly made crude jokes and thought women were just too sensitive. But my husband swore he was a good guy deep down. At the wedding, Patrick took full advantage of the open bar. He got wasted before dinner was even served and started making inappropriate jokes to my bridesmaids. But the worst part, during the bouquet toss, when my maid of honor caught it, Patrick shoved her boyfriend out of the way, grabbed the mic and yelled, "Guess that means she has to marry me now." People laughed nervously, but my maid of honor looked petrified. She tried to step away, but Patrick grabbed her hand and tried to dance with her. She yanked her hand away, and my husband finally stepped in and told Patrick to sit down before he embarrassed himself even more. After the wedding, we both agreed. Patrick wasn't worth keeping in our lives. My husband hasn't spoken to him since. Story 35. My childhood best friend Sophia was supposed to be in my wedding party, but we haven't spoken since. Sophia had always been a bit of a flaky friend, but I thought she would step up when it came to my wedding. I was wrong. First, she missed my bridal shower because she forgot. Then she bailed on my bachelorette party last minute. But the final straw. She texted me the morning of my wedding, hours before the ceremony, and said, "Hey, I'm not feeling great. Think I'm gonna sit this one out. Hope it's fun." I was devastated. She was one of the people I had been most excited to see, and she couldn't even bother to show up. No apology. No explanation. Just gone. I didn't respond. I didn't reach out after, and neither did she. That was the day I realized some people only stick around when it's convenient. Story 36. My cousin Ellie was my maid of honor. We had been inseparable as kids, so I thought she would be the perfect choice to stand by me on my big day. But as soon as I got engaged, I started noticing little things that made me uneasy. She was always a bit jealous of me growing up, but I assumed we had grown out of that. Then, when I told her I had found the one, she went silent. She didn't express excitement or support. Instead, she started pulling away. It wasn't until the day before my wedding that I realized how far things had gone. During the rehearsal dinner, Ellie stood up, And in front of everyone, she announced, "I can't believe you're actually getting married. It's crazy that you're the one to settle down first. We always thought it'd be me." I was stunned. My whole family went silent. She was clearly not happy for me. Afterward, I asked her what was going on, and she just said, "I've always thought I'd be the one to get married first. This feels weird." I was crushed. I tried to salvage the relationship, but she kept making passive-aggressive remarks. The night of my wedding, she barely spoke to me. I haven't talked to her since, and I'm honestly not sure I ever will. Story 37. One of my bridesmaids, Katie, had been one of my closest friends since high school. But the closer we got to the wedding, the more I realized how little she had supported. She constantly complained about the wedding plans, the dresses, the budget, everything. When it came time for the bachelorette party, I had planned something simple, just a nice dinner and some drinks at a local bar. But Katie insisted on a Vegas trip. She sent a long email to all my bridesmaids, telling them they had to go on a trip with her. She said, "It's just what the bride deserves." I felt so uncomfortable. Not only was it a huge cost that I couldn't afford, but it was completely not what I wanted. Then came the night before the wedding. Katie was drunk at the rehearsal dinner and pulled me aside to tell me, "You know, if you were really my best friend, you'd do things my way. This is my weekend too, you know." I was floored. She completely ruined the vibe of the dinner, and after the wedding, she made it clear she wasn't happy with how things went. We drifted apart, and I've barely heard from her since. Story 38. My husband's best man, Greg, and I had never really gotten along. He was a bit of a wild card, always cracking jokes, never taking anything seriously. I thought that maybe, just maybe, he would be on his best behavior for our wedding. Turns out I was wrong. The wedding itself went smoothly, until we reached the reception. Greg gave the worst best man speech I've ever heard. Instead of saying anything nice, he went on a long, embarrassing tangent about my husband's exes. He spent minutes listing every girl my husband had dated in high school, even sharing details about their intimate moments. The entire room was silent, uncomfortable. My husband's face turned bright red, and I just wanted to disappear. Afterwards, Greg laughed it off and said, "Come on, it's funny. Everyone loves a little drama." We had to ask him to leave the wedding. He was furious but refused to apologize. We never spoke to him again after that. Story 39. I was really close to my cousin Vanessa growing up, so when I got engaged, I asked her to be one of my bridesmaids. She seemed thrilled at first, but as the wedding approached, her attitude started to shift. It began when she started posting passive-aggressive messages on social media. Every time I posted about wedding planning, she'd comment something like, "So happy for you, but I could never do this. Too much stress. Maybe you should just elope." I brushed it off as her being dramatic, until the night before my wedding. At the rehearsal dinner, she made a speech. It wasn't a toast, it was a tirade. She told everyone how she wasn't sure about my fiancé, how I was making a mistake, and how I was losing my independence. I was in complete shock. I had no idea she felt this way. My parents tried to diffuse it, but Vanessa wouldn't stop. I ended up having to ask her to leave. She texted me later saying, "I just want what's best for you. You're not seeing the big picture." I never spoke to her again after that. It took me a long time to process how someone could act so selfishly. Story 40. My childhood friend Marissa had always been my confidant. She was someone I trusted with everything, so when I asked her to be a bridesmaid, I thought it was a no-brainer. But when the wedding came around, I started realizing how much of a toxic influence she had become in my life. The first red flag was when she started acting super passive-aggressive during the bridal shower. She didn't like the venue I chose and made sure everyone knew it. She made several comments about how she would have done everything differently and how I should have considered other options for the wedding. But the real breaking point came on the wedding day. During the ceremony, Marissa made a scene. I was walking down the aisle, and I noticed her whispering to another bridesmaid, laughing. Then, right as I was about to say my vows, she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. She's making a huge mistake." The entire room heard it. I stopped mid-vow, stunned. I looked at my fiancé, who looked equally shocked. I couldn't believe my ears. I had to finish the ceremony in tears. Afterward, I pulled her aside and told her she wasn't welcome at my wedding. She tried to apologize, but it felt empty. That was the last time I ever spoke. Story 41. My husband's brother, Sam, was supposed to be the best man at our wedding. But after the wedding, we had to cut ties with him. Sam had always been the wild card of the family. He was fun, spontaneous, and the life of the party, but he didn't take anything seriously. I thought he'd be a great best man, but I quickly realized that his idea of fun was not the kind of fun I wanted at my wedding. It started with the bachelor party. Sam insisted on a wild weekend in Miami. My husband and I were on the same page, a laid-back gathering with close friends. Sam wouldn't hear of it. He made it his mission to turn my husband's pre-wedding weekend into something that was more about him than about the groom. But the real issue came at the wedding itself. During his best man speech, Sam made it all about himself. He spent the first 10 minutes telling embarrassing stories about his past relationships and how lucky my husband was to have found someone who could put up with him. But the worst part? He spent another 5 minutes talking about how hard it was to be single, giving unsolicited advice to everyone about never settling down. It was awkward. My family was uncomfortable. My husband looked embarrassed. After the reception, we didn't speak to Sam for a while. Eventually, he apologized, but it felt insincere. We both realized he had no idea what a real friendship or commitment looked like. It's been 2 years since the wedding, and we've barely spoken. Story 42. My childhood friend, Jen, was my maid of honor, and I never expected what happened at my wedding. We had been best friends for over a decade, but Jen had always struggled with jealousy. She was single at the time, and I could sense some passive-aggressive tension in the months leading up to the wedding. She would often make comments about how lucky I was to have found someone and how nice it must be to have someone to do everything for me. At the wedding, things took a strange turn. During the reception, Jen poured herself a drink and then another. By the time we got to the speeches, she was visibly tipsy. She stood up, and instead of giving a heartfelt speech about our friendship like I had expected, she started talking about her failed relationships, how she couldn't find someone who treated her the way my husband treated me, and how marriage was overrated. It was a disaster. The entire room went silent. My husband tried to laugh it off, but Jen wasn't done. She ended her speech by saying, "I'm not sure if this is going to work out, but I hope for your sake it does." My heart sank. The worst part? Jen didn't apologize. She just walked away and spent the rest of the evening pouting. After the wedding, we barely spoke. Eventually, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been giving more to that friendship than I was receiving. Story 43. One of my bridesmaids, Sophie, had been a friend of mine for years, but I should have known that asking her to be in the wedding party was a mistake. Sophie had always been difficult. She hated commitment, loved drama, and had a knack for turning everything into a crisis. So when I asked her to be a bridesmaid, I wasn't entirely shocked by the drama that ensued. The first issue came with the dress. I picked a simple, elegant design for the bridesmaids, but Sophie decided she didn't like it and went ahead and bought a completely different dress without consulting. She said it was more flattering and more my style. When I confronted her about it, she shrugged and said, "I'm just being honest. You'll thank me later." But the real problem came at the reception. During the first dance, Sophie walked up to my new husband and tried to pull him onto the dance floor with. She was completely drunk and slurring her words, making everyone uncomfortable. She kept pulling him closer and saying things like, "You know, if I wasn't taken, I'd be all over you." My husband finally had enough and asked her to leave. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Later, Sophie texted me saying, "You're being dramatic. It was just a joke." I didn't reply. That night, I realized some people are so self-absorbed they can't see how their actions affect others. We've barely spoken since the wedding. Story 44. I've known Ryan for years. He's been my husband's friend since childhood, and I had no reason to doubt he would be a good groomsman. I was wrong. When I first met Ryan, he seemed like a nice guy, funny, easygoing, and friendly, but I quickly started noticing some red flags as we got closer to the wedding. He had this obsession with proving he was still the life of the party, even though we were all in our late 20s. During the wedding, things took a turn. Ryan gave a speech that was borderline inappropriate. Instead of saying something meaningful, he rambled on about all the wild stories from his bachelor days, painting my husband as a player who had finally settled down. But the worst part? He exposed my husband's past relationships in front of my family. Ryan even mentioned names and details about things that should have stayed private. The entire room was uncomfortable, and my husband was furious. I asked Ryan to leave the reception, and he was indignant, saying, "What's the big deal? I was just being honest." We haven't spoken since. My husband made it clear that anyone who disrespects us like that has no place in our lives. Story 45. My sister, Ella, was my maid of honor. I've always had a complicated relationship with her, but I never thought it would affect my wedding. Ella and I grew up in the same household, but she always acted as though she was the more mature one, constantly criticizing me for being too naive or too young to understand real life. But I still wanted her to be a part of my wedding. During the wedding planning, Ella did everything she could to make me feel insecure. When I picked my wedding dress, she said it made me look too old and wouldn't stop making comments about how everyone else had better dresses. On the day of the wedding, it was worse. She ignored me for most of the ceremony and refused to take any photos with me. When I asked her why she was being so distant, she said, "I just don't feel like it. You know, I never wanted to be your maid of honor in the first place." That was the moment I realized how toxic our relationship had become. The rest of the day was strained, and we never really spoke after the wedding. I didn't need a maid of honor who wasn't fully supportive. We've had limited contact since, and I've accepted that sometimes family isn't the best support system. Story 46. My cousin Lily was one of my bridesmaids. We grew up together, so I thought she would be thrilled to be part of my big day. Unfortunately, I was wrong. It all started when we were picking out the bridesmaid dresses. Lily insisted on wearing something more flattering than what I had chosen, saying, "You know I have body issues. Why can't I just pick my own dress?" I compromised and let her pick a style in the same color, but when the dress arrived, it was completely different. She ordered something much more revealing, and it made the other bridesmaids uncomfortable. Then, at the wedding, things took a turn. During my vows, Lily checked her phone in the middle of the ceremony and started texting. It didn't take long for my mom to spot her, and she immediately gave me that look, like something was off. I asked Lily about it later, and she said, "I was just texting my boyfriend. You're getting married, but I'm still single and have a life, you know?" During the reception, she also grabbed the mic during the speeches and made a comment about how surprising it was that I found someone who could put up with me. It felt like a punch to the gut. Afterward, I asked her to leave. She apologized a couple of weeks later, but the damage was done. We've barely spoken since. Story 47. My best friend Claire was my maid of honor. We had been inseparable since high school, so when I got engaged, she was the obvious choice to be in the wedding party. I had no idea just how much she would turn my wedding into a battle. It started with little comments. She didn't like my wedding venue and said it was too mainstream for someone like me. She didn't like my flowers. She didn't like my photographer. She didn't like anything. But I thought, it's Claire. She's always had strong opinions. The real problem came at the bachelorette party. We went to a small beach town for a weekend getaway, and Claire started to act like the whole thing was her party, not mine. She took over the planning, invited a bunch of random people I didn't know, and turned it into a chaotic event. At one point, she started getting touchy with one of my friend's boyfriends, even though they were in a committed relationship. It was awkward, and the mood was completely ruined. At the wedding, Claire was the last to show up. She made a scene about how she couldn't find her dress and how everything was going wrong. She refused to take photos with me or the other bridesmaids and spent most of the night complaining. I eventually had to ask her to leave, and we haven't spoken since. Story 48. My now husband's best friend, Tony, was in the wedding party. They had been friends since college, and I had always known Tony as the funny, charming guy who could always make you laugh. But on the day of our wedding, he made a joke that crossed a line. It was during the reception, and Tony was giving his speech as best man. Instead of talking about how great my husband was or sharing a heartfelt moment, he started telling embarrassing stories from our relationship. At first it was funny, but then it took a dark turn. He started talking about the times my husband and I had fought, exaggerating the details and making it sound like our relationship was full of drama. The worst part? He kept making jokes about how I was too good to be true and could do better than my husband. My husband sat there, mortified, while I tried to keep it together, not wanting to cause a scene. Afterward, when I tried to confront Tony, he said, "It was just a joke." Everyone loved it. I couldn't believe it. I asked my husband to step in, and we both agreed that we didn't want him around anymore. We haven't talked to Tony since.